One of the many cool additions to Dead Rising 3 were hostile survivors. Survivors who would defect prematurely and have to be killed, either to save another survivor or simply out of self-defense. From a swindler to a used car salesman to an optional battle with Gary pulling out his old wrestling moves. Coincidentally, these tend to be some of the darker missions in the game. The darkest of these missions, however, never made it to the final product. In the game's files, there exists a side quest known as Till Death Do Us Part. There are no remnants of the mission in the game, except for the mission titles, which gives us a shockingly vivid idea of how the mission would play out, and it also provides the name of the survivors. And while neither of these two, Nikki and Bernard, still appear in the final game, both of their profile pics have been recovered. More on what they were used for at the end of the video. But first, let's break down how this mission could have played out. The first three objectives are clear-cut. Investigate Jug's bar, talk to Bernard, and find Nikki. What gets weird is that the next mission is find Nikki's husband, followed by escort Nikki to Bernard. This implies Nick doesn't learn that Bernard and Nikki are married until later in the mission. We also know that Nikki would tag along for the search for her husband, as it would have the title Return to Nikki if Nick actually needed to return to her. The escort Nikki to Bernard part would also mean that the player doesn't bring her back right to Bernard, but goes somewhere else first, and presumably, a conversation occurs that has Nikki finally name Bernard as her husband. Then the mission updates to Return to Bernard, meaning there's a point between where you escort Nikki to Bernard and then actually talking to him personally. She would not follow Nick to him. Then the mission updates to Protect Nikki, as Bernard presumably goes on the offensive shortly after Nick talks to him. Let's take that general layout and apply some locations now. Obviously the first two take place at Jug's bar, but I'd be willing to bet the whole mission is confined to Sunset Hills. You can tell the bar specifically was meant for this mission because a song plays on loop, in which case the singer begs for someone not to run away. As for why the mission would likely remain in Sunset Hills, it's meant to be the high-end district of Los Perdidos, similar to the real-life Los Angeles at the time, and both Bernard and Nikki are some of the best-dressed survivors in the game. As for where to find Nikki, I went looking through Sunset Hills and noticed there's a conveniently placed divorce attorney's office known as Severed Ties on the other side of Sunset Hills, which would be an easy place to keep Nikki safe by despawning any zombies in the building. After this, there needs to be a place to take her where she thinks Bernard could be. The only place I could think of that would serve this purpose would be what I assume is their house, the unnamed fancy house in the final game. Most of the side quests in Sunset Hills involve the houses of the survivors anyway, and the aptly titled Fancy House goes completely unused for both survivor missions and the survival challenges. So after investigating both floors of the fancy house, they find his dead cell phone on the floor, and Nick learns that Bernard is indeed her husband, the guy he found back at the bar. When bringing Nikki back, she stays outside in the parking lot while Nick goes in to talk to Bernard, who is now surrounded by a lot of booze and has been throwing up all over the place. Upon realizing that Bernard is going to hurt her, or worse, Nick has to intervene to save her. Bernard will not appreciate this, and defects to attack Nick as well. I don't think he'd be armed with any weapons, and instead would use the various heavy attacks the glove weapons have with his bare hands. This would give him a lot of wind-up and knockback to his attacks, but not deal a lot of damage, giving Nick time to interrupt him before he could hurt Nikki too badly. Now for some dialogue for the mission, which I have based on the locations and events that I've brought up thus far. I do not think this is going to literally be the dialogue the mission would have used. This is more about setting the tone and giving an idea of what I think would happen in more detail. So that's the general idea. Nick meets a man at a bar waiting for a woman, Nick goes to find her, tries to find her husband, realizes the man back at the bar is her husband, and has to protect her from said husband through intervention. The final thing of note is I think this would be one of the earlier missions in the game, the very start of Chapter 2 to be precise, when Nick first gets access to Sunset Hills. I've always found it weird that the game introduces hostile survivors with 2 back-to-back missions, Lesser Evil and Blood Barter. The only other mission that requires you to defeat a hostile survivor is Will or Away in the next chapter. After that, any other hostile survivor encounters are meant to be avoided through the player's actions. I personally believe that this mission was meant to be a soft introduction to hostile survivors as a concept. So, if I was even remotely correct in my assessment of the mission, why would they have removed it, especially when so much work clearly went into it either way? The obvious answer is the tone and subject matter. This is a dark mission, even for Dead Rising 3. No matter how nasty you choose to write Bernard, it involves the player having to kill a woman's husband, abusive or otherwise. That's too real, if you will. A disturbingly more plausible situation than an angry pimp or a used car salesman trying to get a will. But I don't think it's because Dead Rising can't handle such a mission. Sensitive subject matters like suicide are reoccurring through all the games, even in my own pitched version of this mission. But I also think that Nick Ramos is not the right character for this kind of mission. Nick's a well-meaning guy, but isn't one to make assumptions about other people. Even as he gets more assertive throughout the story, this remains true for his character, and it was the guiding principle for how I wrote him in this particular pitch. I also had to limit what Nikki could say to Nick for this to work. Otherwise, it makes Nick come off as an idiot, all the while making sure that Dick's dialogue can contrast with Nick's while still making sense for both Dick as a character and the situation. This feels more like something I would expect Chuck to interact with than Nick. Then there's the gameplay mechanic of posse members. I think I did a good job writing this mission out, all in all, but the aftermath for all of this would be Nikki becoming an action sidekick to the man who just murdered her husband. Again, no matter how awful Bernard ends up, this just comes off as poor taste. This would have worked a lot better if this was a classic game where you had to take the survivors to a safe place to rest, not as makeshift soldiers against the zombies. And finally, there's the backlash. Not to the mission, but the game itself. Dead Rising 3, upon its initial reveal, received a lot of backlash from a part of the fanbase that did not like the more serious tone this game seemed to be going for. And, coupled with everything I just said, I could easily see them deciding to scrap this mission as a result of that. Players who know of this cut mission think that Lesser Evil replaced it. Understandably so, as Lesser Evil was likely one of the last missions added to the game, and feels like an over-the-top version of this mission in a way. Big D and Candy also don't have their proper names, not even in the game's files. They only ever go by their street names, if you will, which is weird given the game's files have the full name of both Peter and his mother. The game's files are actually how we know Bernard Kingsley is the husband's name, by the way. Big D has a more simplistic design compared to other characters in the game. Candy's stats are just a jack-of-all-trades instead of specializing in anything, and the location you fight Big D in is way too small for a hostile encounter against a gun-wielding enemy. Speaking of guns, Big D's 50 caliber pistol is just the machine pistol from Sergeant Hilday, with all the attachments removed, and a standard pistol color scheme, but they're otherwise one-to-one in design and in sound. The biggest evidence, though, is that Bernard's bulletin board profile is labeled as Big D's. And in the unused ending X, Bernard's textures are applied to Big D's frame, making him look a lot chunkier than his profile would lead you to believe. Some would say this proves he was explicitly replaced, but I'm not so sure. My personal theory is that Bernard and Nikki were axed before Big D's mission was placed in. They decided to give Big D Bernard's place in the game, while saving Nikki for later in case they found a use for her in the main game. But before they could update the bulletin board with Big D's proper profile, they axed the player's ability to side with some of the hostile survivors over their hostages, and so all of the hostile survivors were removed from the bulletin board altogether. Nikki would ultimately be used in Episode 2 of the DLC as the face of the survivors that Angel saves in the final push of the mini-campaign. They really lucked out with Nikki in hindsight. It gives them a very high-quality character model that the player has never seen before to thank Angel in the final cutscene, and the black eye Nikki was supposed to have gotten from Bernard can be written off as the brutality of the soldiers, not that they ever comment on it. Bernard himself wouldn't be used in any part of the game at all, but his assets were reworked into the Secret Service members, It's very noticeable with the black service members who greatly resemble him. While it's also possible that he was meant to be a member of the Secret Service who went AWOL, I doubt that as well. Much like Nicky running around with the illegals, I think they just took advantage of the high-quality assets, and it's not indicative of how he would have been used in the game. I do think his model should have been used as a final Secret Service member to get the key to the President's room, like how Kane himself was the super soldier in the main game Nick had to defeat to escape the compound. Dead Rising 3 has a good deal of cut content that I do think would have made the game better, and I would like to look at more of that in the future, but I can't say Till Death Do Us Part would be part of that list. I don't think it would have been a bad addition by any means. If anything, I would have had a lot of respect for them sticking with it. But unlike the feature of the destructible doors a la Left 4 Dead, or a joke ending meant to punish Let's Players and streamers who kill survivors while going for the true ending, this really wouldn't add much beyond, at most, an introduction to hostile survivors, which is something the game works just fine without. I don't think that Bernard or Nicky would have been particularly compelling characters, because the heaviness of the situation would have taken priority. And it would kinda have to. And, honestly, I don't think Nicky would have had particularly good stats. Most players probably would have never used her. Players already tend to just fall into using the best survivors in the game anyway. So while I find the idea of what could have been really interesting, I can actually understand cutting a mission this dark from the game. And I'd be lying if I said the game would be a whole lot better if it was added.
Poor kid! Give me a break! He's loaded, and if his bitch of a mother was dumb enough to marry me, then I deserve that money. Sorry, kid, but I guess my only option out of this BS is to get rid of all the witnesses. Oh!
We won't be cheating anyone else in this lifetime.